Hello, my name is Abigail Adams, and I'm an undergraduate student at Virginia Tech studying animal science and agricultural education. After I graduate, I'm going to get my master's in ag education and teach in the public school system. I'm currently a teaching assistant in the animal agriculture and environment class, and this is my lecture on manure management on small farms and homesteads. Everything I discuss in this lecture is backed by credible sources, which are listed in the description of this video. I come from a small farm, and it's my goal to have a homestead. Homesteaders are recyclers. Animals are very important to the homesteading life because they recycle what we don't use, and we recycle what they don't use. We make our food, we feed them the scraps, they make poop, we use their poop to grow more food, and the cycle continues. In the environment world, this is called the nutrient cycle. We aren't going to go in depth on the nutrient cycle in this lecture, but we are going to discuss how to use that manure to our benefit while ensuring that we don't hurt the environment. To start, let's discuss the different types of manure. Some animals make liquid manure and some make dry manure, and this changes how you can manage it. Dairy cattle swine manure is more on the watery side, and on large farms it usually gets washed into a manure lagoon. If you have a small farm with only a few of these animals, then incorporating bedding materials like straw, shavings, or other dry waste is a good way to make it stackable. Horses, poultry, and beef cattle have drier manure, so it stacks nicely. Most small farm manure piles will be what is called farmyard manure, which basically means that it's a mix of everything on the farm. Different animal feces, waste feed, straw, old bedding, and whatever else can get thrown in a manure pile on a farm. So it tends to stack better. I made this table to help you visualize what I'm talking about. You can see how the cow manure is more liquid compared to the horse manure, and then on the end is a picture of farm manure, and you can see how it's a mixture of different things. Composted manure is also a mixture, but it's been broken down, and in this picture you can see them adding some scraps to it with the darker, more soil-looking manure in the lower corner there. Now let's talk about the different ways to use and store manure. Firstly, many small farms do not have enough manure to warrant a covering for their storage area, but environmentally speaking, it is the best practice for any farm to prevent rainwater nutrient runoff. It's even required for small CAFOs, which are commercial animal feeding operations, so I would go ahead and cover your pile. The three things you need to consider when storing manure is the location, size, and purpose. The location should be near the barn or animal housing for convenience and out of any floodplains to prevent runoff. Some people also care about the smell and wind direction, but that's up to you and your neighbors. Probably don't let the wind carry the smell to your neighbor's house. Also, when considering smell, know that poultry and swine manure smells worse than other types of manure, so you'll have to account for that. The size of the storage area depends on how many animals you have, how much manure they produce, and how long it will be stored, and how much you want to pay to install your system. For example, a 4-pound laying hen will make about 0.26 pounds of manure a day, and a horse can make up to 50 pounds of manure a day, so it's important to know how much you can accommodate on your farm. In a pasture-based system, like this photo, where your animals are outside all the time, the manure is more naturally spread and evenly distributed among the pasture, so those places don't worry about manure management as much, unless you have a high animal density. If you have more than 500 pounds of animal per acre or are supplementing their pasture with grain, then you can get out of balance and you need to have a manure management option. The same is true if you have confined animals. Their pens need to be cleaned out, so you need to know what to do with their poop. Option 1 for manure storage is stockpiling. Stockpiling is very cheap and ideal for farms with only a few animals because it is just a pile of poop. Most of the people I know do this because it's easy to do. However, there are some things you need to do to prevent runoff and rutting. Compact is key here. This can be as simple as a compacted gravel pad. It should be slightly sloped so that water can drain, and it should drain in the direction of a lot of vegetation so that any runoff nutrients get absorbed by the plants. This is called a vegetative filter strip or vegetative buffer. This picture is a great example from Alaska with a tarp being used as a cover. Option 2 is dry stacking. This is a somewhat cheap way to do it, but it's not as cheap as stockpiling. And it's the most common option for small animal operations. 50 chickens, 20 pigs, a small family-owned type venture. It'll be an area with 3 walls that are at least 4 foot high, surrounding a concrete pad that is slightly sloped for drainage, and drains into a vegetative buffer. Manure is usually piled on the pad and pushed back by a front-end loader. The Virginia Tech equitation barn uses this type of manure management system. This picture is a good example, but you would want a cover to be extra environmentally friendly. Option 3 is composting. This is a little more on the pricey side depending on how complicated you want to get with it, and it is labor intensive. It can be done with very little animals or a larger amount of animals, and it is done by balancing the nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and water concentration of the manure. The center of the pile will get really hot and kill pathogens. However, you have to take the temperature regularly and mix the pile on a regular basis for it to happen effectively. This will have to be a covered pile so that the water content can be controlled. A large composting structure is basically the dry stacking structure, but with a roof. A small composting structure could be a sealed container. The larger areas could be aerated with a skid steer or front-end loader, and the smaller containers could be turned by a shovel or rake. If composting is done correctly, the manure can be composted within 6 weeks, which will have reduced nutrient content and more closely resemble soil. This image is an example of a small compost bin. To learn more about composting, see my other lecture video. Important point, a pile of manure just sitting there is not composting, it is decomposing. There is a difference. Option 4 is something called liquid storage, which is on most pig and dairy farms, but we're not going to talk about it because it's really meant for larger farms. Managing the manure pile is key. You can't just let it sit there. You have to use it. In order to complete the nutrient cycle, we have to apply it back to the ground. You can apply it to your own soil or you can sell it to others. Giving some to your neighbors might reduce any tension over the smell of the pile. You also want to reduce your manure pile during the winter so that there is less substance for flies to lay eggs in come spring and summer. But that's more of a pest control type of lecture. And for those that don't know, this image here represents a manure spreader for dry manure. Moving on to the uses of manure. Most people know that manure is used as a fertilizer, but you cannot apply it to your crops willy-nilly because there is a risk of nutrient runoff. Nutrient runoff happens when manure gets rained on and nitrogen and phosphorus get carried into waterways. This can lead to eutrophication and fish kills. To prevent this, ensure you apply the manure on a dry day and that you measure the nutrient content of your soil and manure. Measuring your nutrient content sounds like it'll involve a lab and a lot of time, but it doesn't. You can get some farm soil nitrogen and phosphorus tests that only take 3 minutes. All you have to do is get a soil sample, mix it with water, put it in the test container, shake it up, dip the test strip in it, and decide what color the strip is. You also have to do this to the manure that you're going to use. See the UC Davis link for the specific step-by-step instructions. This image shows a few of the different nutrient tests you can do. This pack can be bought off of Amazon for just $15. Then you have to decide how much nitrogen or phosphorus your specific crop needs and add manure to the soil to match that need. This chart is specifically for potatoes, but there are charts for nearly every major food crop. Another thing to consider is which nutrient you want to provide for. Nitrogen is more prevalent in manure than phosphorus, and the reason we've had such a big problem in the past is that people realized they were not getting enough phosphorus in their crop, so they measured for phosphorus instead of nitrogen and wound up grossly oversupplying nitrogen, which is why people focus more on nitrogen now. Most homesteaders or small garden people do not separate out their crops like large crop farmers do, so a good thing to do is called companion planting. I don't think there's one specific name for it. I've heard it called marriage growth, partner growth, and double planting. The basic concept is that you grow plants together based on their ability to complement one another. Historically, corn, squash, and beans are grown together. The corn gives the beans a stalk to grow up, and the beans are a legume or nitrogen fixer, which converts raw nitrogen into nitrate by adding oxygen to it and making it usable by the plant. And squash has large leaves that shade the ground and keep it moist. Doing this means that any excess nitrogen will be converted and more easily used. This chart lists a few of the crops that can be grown together. You can see corn, beans, and squash towards the bottom of the list. Finally, most people do not use fresh manure in their crops, but if you do, make sure you add it to the soil at least 3 months before you harvest. 4 months if you have root crops or greens, to make sure that any bacteria in the manure have gone before you consume the food. This is where using composted manure is better because there's less of a bacteria risk. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture, and I hope you have a great day.